Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents How to Argue with a Racist, What Our Genes Do and Don't Say About Human Difference, by Adam Rutherford. Narrated by Adam Rutherford. Publisher's Note: this audiobook contains bonus material, consisting of new introductory material. Please visit Tantor.com and type How to Argue with a Racist into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page. Then, under the supplemental content section, please enter the access code DIVERSITY, and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters.
For Ananda, Ben, Jake, Nathaniel, and all of my more distant sisters and brothers. The world is a fine place and worth fighting for, Ernest Hemingway, for whom the bell tolls. A note on language. This is a deliberately concise book, and I have selected only arguments and cases that are illustrative. I'll be using terminology that is not without historical baggage. I'll be using words such as black and East Asian, while simultaneously acknowledging that they are poor scientific designations for the immense diversity within these billions of people. It is an irony that we roughly know what these descriptors mean colloquially, while they are potentially incoherent in terms of scientific taxonomy. The semantics of this book and the broader public discourse are important. Though much of the book discusses the validity of the term race, I'll be using it primarily because it is a term that people recognize and use, regardless of its scientific validity. Population, ancestry, and lineage are all terms that are more useful as discussions of human evolution and diversity become more technical. This book is largely focused on racism derived from Western and European cultures, partly because these are my cultures, but also because the concepts of race that we are broadly globally wedded to emerged in Europe and were enshrined in culture alongside European expansion, the emergence of science as we recognize it today, and the values of the Enlightenment. Introduction. This book is a weapon. It is written to equip you with the scientific tools necessary to tackle questions on race, genes, and ancestry. It is a toolkit to help separate fact from myth in understanding how we are similar and how we are different. Our story began in Africa. The earliest known members of our species, Homo sapiens, evolved in what is now Morocco around 300,000 years ago, though most early remains are from the east of Africa. We're starting to think that in the beginning we came from a pan-African species, a mixture of diverse populations from around that mighty continent. We know that some early humans migrated into Asia and Europe within the last 250,000 years, but their dominion outside of Africa was temporary, and they probably leave no descendants today. Around 70,000 years ago, another group of people drifted away from Africa, and the process of setting down new roots all over this planet began. Much of our global success is a result of local adaptations, fine-tuned by evolution to best survive environments on an ecologically diverse planet. Our quintessential nature as wanderers, hunters, farmers, and social creatures meant that over the last few thousand years, Earth has become smaller, and peoples from around the world have met, traded, mated, fought, conquered, and a whole lot more. In these interactions, we engage with people who are different from each other. These differences are rooted in biology, in DNA, and also in our behavior as social animals, in our dress, our speech, our religions, and our interests. In the pursuit of power and wealth, the fetishization of these differences has been the source of the cruelest acts in our short history. The political climate has changed in the last few years. Around the world, nationalism is on the rise, and discussions of race seem to be more prominent in the public arena than in years. Stereotypes and myths about race are expressed not just by overt racists whose voices are amplified by modern technology, but also by well-intentioned people whose experience and cultural history steer them towards views that are not supported by the modern study of human genetics. the misattribution of athletic success to ancestry rather than training, the continued assumptions that East Asian students are inherently better at maths, that black people have some kind of natural rhythm, or that Jews are good with money. We all know someone who thinks along these lines. The ideas examined in these pages form a scientific description of real human similarities and differences that will provide a foundation to contest racism that appears to be grounded in science. Here, I'm focusing on 4 key areas where we often slip up by adhering to stereotypes and assumptions. I'm outlining what we can and cannot know, according to contemporary science, on the subjects of skin colour, ancestral purity, sports, and intelligence. It is often easier to make a claim than to refute it, but as racism is being expressed in public more openly today, it is our duty to contest it with facts and nuance, especially if bigotry claims science as its ally. Some scientists are not that comfortable with expressing opinions derived from their research where it relates to questions of race. Nevertheless, if you study human genetics, the ocean from which human variation is drawn, you have little choice but to speak of race. The visible differences that are the roots of racism are encoded in our DNA. Therefore, science and racism are inherently entwined. Racism is an expression of prejudice, whereas science, in principle, is free from subjectivity and judgment. Reluctance by scientists to express views concerning the politics that might emerge from human genetics is a position perhaps worth reconsidering, as people who misuse science for ideological ends have no such compunction and embrace modern technology to spread their messages far and wide. But science is a powerful ally, and knowledge of science and of history arms us against preconceptions and prejudice. We have profoundly limited senses and short lives. We crave meaning and belonging and identity. Those aspects of the human condition are a rich soil in which prejudice can take root. The tool that grants us the clearest view of how people actually are, rather than how we judge them to be, is science. I am British. My identity is legally enshrined in my passport, the property of the United Kingdom. It was issued in Ipswich, a town near the East Anglian coast where I was born. These are facts. Britain, United Kingdom, Ipswich, East Anglia, they are labels that partly define my personal identity. I'm also a scientist. I've studied genetics and evolution all my adult life, and I write about how history intersects with those two forces of biology. In science, we use labels out of necessity. We try to apply rigorous criteria in our labeling to help us categorize the inherent qualities of a thing, so that we might understand its identity, its essential nature, or its evolution, or so that we can design experiments that will help us understand its qualities. We call this taxonomy. I am mixed race, or dual heritage, or biracial. Half-caste is a term which has fallen out of favour, but for much of my life that is how many have described me, some out of habit, occasionally in a dismissive way. I'm often asked where I'm from, and I adjust my answer by second-guessing what they're really asking. Britain, England, Suffolk, Ipswich, or London, where I've lived for 25 years, all are true. But often, what they are really asking is, why do you look the way that you do? My father was born in Yorkshire, with both his parents being white and British. My mother is British and Indian, though she has never set foot in India. She was born in Guyana in South America. Her grandparents were shipped there from India in the 19th century to work on sugar plantations under the auspices of a colonial edict known as indenture, a form of semi-forced migration and labour that is a shadow of slavery. She emigrated to England in the 1960s in the wake of the Empire Windrush, the ship that brought 802 Caribbean women and men to begin new lives in Britain in the aftermath of the Second World War. Like them, she was a British citizen invited to the homeland of the colonies as the imperial age waned. They were bidden to help rebuild a country broken by war, and like so many who made that journey, my mother was recruited into the fledgling National Health Service to attend to the citizens of the United Kingdom. My parents did not stay together, and when I was young, my father, sister and I merged into a new family, where I acquired 3 more brothers, though technically they are 2 stepbrothers and a half-brother. I lived in Ipswich until I was 18 and then went on to study genetics at University College London. I've remained in London and tethered to UCL ever since. I do not consider myself to be half-caste or half anything. The nature of my upbringing has been that I have no cultural affinity with India, though, like so many Brits, I love 2 things that India does better than any other nation: curry and cricket. Yet it is undeniable that biologically half my DNA is more closely associated with 1.3 billion Indian people than it is with 740 million Europeans, and of course the obverse is also true. I didn't study genetics and evolution because of my heritage. I chose it because it is by far the most interesting branch of scientific research, which underwrites every single aspect of the life sciences. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, said the Russian-American scientist Theodosius Dobzhansky, a mantra that should be as widely known as any. I got lucky in that I stumbled into a field of science at a time when it was about to enter a golden age of discovery. The Human Genome Project officially started the year I went to university, and its fruit, a draft of the entire genetic code of a human being, was completed the year I finished my PhD, also in human genetics. I used that DNA database extensively to hunt for genes that build our eyes and govern how we see. Since then, that colossal, glorious scientific endeavour, and the technology and data that followed, have formed the bedrock on which future genetics, and in turn all biology, would forever be transformed. UCL is one of the great universities. The foundations of genetics and evolution were developed there during the first half of the 20th century, as Darwinian ideas were fused with the emerging concept of genes via statistics, experimentation, and maths. There, on Gower Street in Bloomsbury, much of the structure of modern biology was being cooked up. But some of the most pernicious ideas in human history also have deep roots at UCL. Most significantly, it was intrinsically associated with the birth of eugenics, the idea that, via selective breeding, human populations could be improved and weakness eliminated from societies. These ideas were primarily formulated in Britain by the scientist and avowed racist Francis Galton, though they were never enshrined in law here. We came perilously close in 1912. The Mental Deficiency Bill was brought before Parliament with a eugenics amendment that would prohibit marriage and procreation between the feeble-minded, as was the vernacular of the time. The clause was removed by the MP Josiah Wedgwood before the bill was passed into law in 1913. In contrast, the governments of the USA, Sweden, Nazi Germany, and other countries had active eugenics policies that resulted in the forced sterilizations and deaths of millions. Eugenics and racism are not the same ideas, but they are inherently connected, and eugenics policies disproportionately affected and targeted racial minorities. I didn't choose UCL because of its peculiar history, though I was enrolled into the Galton Laboratory, which was once called the Galton Eugenics Laboratory, and I was taught by the Galton professor in the Galton Lecture Theatre, all named after Francis Galton, a man whose intellectual legacy includes weather maps, a phalanx of essential statistical techniques, forensic fingerprints, and the scientific concept of eugenics, as well as the word itself. Galton died in 1911, and the men who followed him at my alma mater were similarly great scientists: the statistician Karl Pearson, the mathematical biologist Ronald Fisher, and others, men on whose shoulders stand entire domains of contemporary science, and who, to varying degrees, also expressed racist views. To call them racist is not a judgment based on contemporary sensibilities. It is a factual statement. They articulated opinions that were racist, as were the cultural and scientific norms of the time. There are many examples of Galton's racist views, but they are perhaps most explicitly stated in his letter to the Times on the 5th of June 1873, headlined, "Africa for the Chinese." Quote, "My proposal is to make the encouragement of the Chinese settlements at one or more suitable places on the east coast of Africa a part of our national policy, in the belief that the Chinese immigrants would not only maintain their position, but that they would multiply and their descendants supplant the inferior Negro race." I should expect the large part of the African seaboard, now sparsely occupied by lazy, palavering savages living under the nominal sovereignty of the Zanzibar or Portugal, might in a few years be tenanted by industrious, order-loving Chinese. Of all known varieties of mankind, there is none so appropriate as the Chinaman to become the future occupant of the enormous regions which lie between the tropics. The Hindu cannot fulfill the required conditions nearly as well as the Chinaman, for he is inferior to him in strength, industry, aptitude for saving, business habits, and prolific power. The Arab is little more than an eater-up of other men's produce. He is a destroyer rather than a creator, and he is unprolific." End quote. Science is wont to change as new data becomes available. By the 1990s, we studied these men's scientific legacies whilst acknowledging that their attitudes and beliefs were racist. Their views were not shared, even superficially, by any of the scientists who taught me. That I am both British and a geneticist are two objective facts laden with centuries of context. I am the evolutionary descendant of colonialism, empire, racism, and some pretty odious ideologies. My own story is not particularly unusual or interesting. Politics and families are messy. People move, fall in love, have children, and repeat any or all of these within or between generations. That is all the biographical information needed for this story, but in some senses, all my multiple lines of ancestry, biological, cultural, and scientific, have inevitably clashed. I haven't endured a great deal of racial abuse in my life. I am light-skinned and my Indian or Indo-Guyanese heritage is far from obvious. But in the last couple of years, in response to writing and talking about human history, genetics and race, strangers have called me a Paki, a Jewish rat, and a race traitor with insidious influence. My Indian heritage is not Pakistani as far as we know. I have no significant Jewish ancestry, though my acquired stepfamily does. And I believe my alleged racial treachery is because I married a white English woman. I've been told that I should be grateful for colonialisation and the British Empire as, without it, I would not exist. Technically, this argument is correct, though it is pretty nuts. The cultural conversation has changed in recent years, and the vocal expression of racism feels more prevalent today than it has been in decades. In 1939, Agatha Christie published her best-selling thriller, 10 Little Niggers, which remained in print in the UK with that title until 1963, before becoming either 10 Little Indians or And Then There Were None. A year later, a Member of Parliament was elected to represent the Smethwick area of Birmingham with campaign leaflets bearing the slogan, "If you want a nigger for a neighbour, vote Labour." In the 1980s, thousands of football fans would shout, "Shoot that nigger," about black players on their own team, such as the great John Barnes, Viv Anderson, and Ian Wright. Race hatred trumped team loyalty. At my school, some boys would play a game where they would leave a 2-pence piece on the ground and then shout Jew or kike at anyone who unwittingly picked it up. We like to think that explicit racism is no longer openly part of culture, society, or sport, though in 2018, banana skins were being thrown onto football pitches at black players such as Arsenal's Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, as they routinely were 3 or 4 decades ago, to assert that the players are closer to monkeys than humans. This, by the way, is a terribly misguided attempt at bigotry. Edible bananas are an entirely human invention, and monkeys aren't that into bananas anyway. When a banana was thrown at Barcelona player Dani Alves in 2014, he had the good grace and composure to eat it. It's not easy to assess how racist a society is. People are reluctant to volunteer information, even anonymously, that might be perceived as culturally unacceptable. In British national attitude surveys that have been running since 1983, the proportion of people who describe themselves as either not prejudiced against people of another race at all, or very or little racially prejudiced, has remained static, 60 to 70% and 25 to 40% respectively. Instead, we might use proxies, such as asking people whether they would be happy if a close relative were to marry a person of black or Asian background. In 2017, over a fifth of white Brits answered that they would mind. This is a racist view. But when that question was asked in the equivalent survey in 1983, the answer was more than 50%. The same question was asked in 2017, but not before then, about the prospect of a Muslim spouse, and the answer was more than 2/5 of people would be bothered. It's sometimes argued that as Islam is a religion, then Muslims are not a race, therefore prejudice against Muslims cannot be racism. This is true in a very literal sense. However, for the purposes of the comparison between the 1983 and the 2017 statistics, the bigotry and prejudice against a specific group of people often resembles racism very closely, even though they might not be categorized as a traditionally defined race. Similarly, prejudice against the people of a specific country, for example, Romanians, is effectively an equivalent form of cultural racism. This is but one fuzzy metric that indicates that attitudes towards race are relaxing in some directions and reflects the fact that culture changes. The British police indicated that reports of racist attacks went up in 2016, around the time of the referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union. Even that, though, is not a metric that can be definitively interpreted as an increase in racism in the UK. It could be that the frequency of crime is static, but willingness to report it has increased, emboldened by positive responses from the police. The 19th century abolitionist preacher Theodore Parker said that the moral arc of the world tends towards justice. And while this may be true, it does not mean that bigotry evaporates. It merely rearms according to the prevalent culture. White people in Britain are apparently less comfortable today with Muslims than they are with black or Asian Brits who are not Muslim. Concepts of race have always been associated with attempts to categorize humans, sometimes to simply describe them, often to create pseudoscientific delineations with the intention of subjugation and exploitation. While it may be difficult to assess how racist a people is, and whether that is changing, we can track with perfect accuracy how science changes. Discoveries are made, knowledge is created, techniques evolve, and all of it is documented meticulously. The field of genetics, with its racist past, has undergone radical transformation in its short history. It has grown to be not just intrinsic to scientific research, but is also now integrated into the wider culture and has become a huge commercial business endeavour targeted at ordinary people. We know more about human variation, migration, and our own history than ever before, and this exposure has invigorated questions of race. Genetics is merely the scientific study of families, of sex, and inheritance, all ideas that preoccupied human minds for millennia before Darwin, Mendel, Watson and Crick, and the other scientific pioneers that ushered in the current era. Human genetics is the study of similarities and differences between people and populations. There were major transitions in genetics in the 20th century. The discovery of the structure of DNA, the cracking of the genetic code, the birth of the endeavour to read the entirety of human DNA. These were necessary preludes to a perpetual revolution occurring in genetics in the 21st century. Following the Human Genome Project, our ability to sequence and understand DNA has exploded beyond any expectations that we might have had in the 1990s. We have the genetic code of millions of people in databases that scientists pore over and mine for wispy clues about diseases, behaviour, and ancestry. Even more unanticipated, a growing number of these people are dead and have been for hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of years. The DNA from those old bones provides incomparable data on our history and prehistory, on how we migrated from Africa and flooded the earth. These records tell us what people were like before we began documenting our own lives. Most scientific research is done in the public domain, and most genomic databases are open for all to mine. But they are dwarfed by the number of genomes that have been sampled and are owned by a handful of genetic genealogy companies who, for £100 and a tube full of spit, will provide you with a map of the people on Earth whose DNA yours most closely resembles. Direct-to-consumer genetic testing, as it's known, is a murky area scientifically and ethically, prone to gross simplification and romantic storytelling, and I'll scrutinize it later in this book. Millions of people have paid for and taken these tests. I spend a lot of time talking about genetics in public, and I've observed an interesting phenomenon. Once you arm people with their own genetic code, which has been inaccessible and incomprehensible until now, the cultural conversations about race, identity, ethnicity, and genetics change. Mostly, it's trivial. White people always want to discover that they're descended from Vikings, because let's face it, Vikings were really cool. In part 2, I'll be explaining why all people of European descent have Viking ancestors. Irish, Welsh, and Scots like to claim Celtic genetic genealogy, despite the fact that Celtic isn't a coherent ancestral population, and cultural similarities betray the fact that according to the latest genetic data, those three groupings are frequently more similar to mainland English people than they are to each other. In this sense, using contemporary genetics to assert these types of cultural identities is not very fruitful. But it's also of little consequence. We desire membership to clans, tribes, and families, and while these narratives can be drawn from geography, nationhood, and history, ancestral genetics says very little about them. At the far end of the same spectrum, white nationalists and neo-Nazis are also co-opting genetics as a means of asserting their ethnicity and therefore their supposed racial superiority. In 2018, neo-Nazis in America introduced a new way of showing off their supposed racial superiority. They filmed themselves chugging milk, that is, gulping down cow's milk with their shirts off in a ridiculous attempt to demonstrate their genetically encoded capacity to process lactose, a sugar in milk that cannot be digested by the majority of humans after weaning, apart from Europeans. The gene mutations that allow this enzymatic ability, known as lactase persistence, arose in Europe around 8,000 years ago, and the ostentatious showcasing of a random mutation that nature selected to allow some people to drink milk throughout their life without minor tummy troubles is somehow associated with their assertion of racial superiority. They are presumably unaware that the same mutations emerged independently and exist at a high frequency in Kazakhs, Ethiopians, Tutsi, Khoisan, and many places where dairy farming was a significant part of their agricultural evolution, including not just milk from cows and goats, but camel milk for pastoralists in the Middle East. Risible though milk chugging is, avowed racists have shown a great interest in modern genetics as a tool in their armoury, with a similar degree of misunderstanding of the complexities of human evolution and history as those who simply yearn to be a bit Viking. More broadly, population genetics is being co-opted to reaffirm old and natural tendencies that we have to seek meaning and identity in our societies. Attempts to justify racism have always been rooted in science, or more specifically in misunderstood, misrepresented, or just plain specious science. It never went away, but now we stand at the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century. Racism is making an overt comeback, revitalized by the new genetics. This science is hard. It relies on wading through the largest and most complex data set that we are aware of, the human genome. The tools we apply to extract meaningful information from a code made up of 3 billion letters are immensely complicated too, statistical nightmares that require both expertise and deep thought. The history of race, of colonialization, empire, invasion, and slavery is similarly tortuous, and the subject of serious academic scrutiny. But the expression of these disciplines is in everyone's lives. Humans come packed with prejudices, taught and learnt and acquired through experience, and these can form the foundations of views that are not supported by contemporary science. We crave simple stories to make sense of our identities. This desire is at odds with the reality of human variation, evolution, and history, which are messy and extremely complicated, but they are recorded in our genes. The aim of this book is to anatomize and lay out precisely what our DNA can and can't tell us about the concept of race. Human genetics is the study of how we are different and how we are the same as each other.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?